Thank you all. This is a real treat for me, and I think it's a real treat for everyone here to get to talk with you today, Jigar. And I'm going to say this, and I think you're really kind of the godfather of how we finance the solar revolution. And for those of you that are not totally familiar with Jigar's incredible career, he is the co-founder of Generate Capital, an investment and operating platform that builds, operates, and owns and finances infrastructure assets involving the world's critical resources from energy, water, agriculture, and basic materials. But Jigar has a long career from Sun Edison to the Carbon War Room. You've done it. You've seen it all. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's a real pleasure. I started coming to San Antonio in, I think, 2007 at the request of Bill Sinkin, who used to run his Solar San Antonio dinners. And it, when you see the changes that have occurred here in that 10-year period of time, it's really extraordinary how quickly we've moved from, trying to build, generation that was really difficult to build in the past to, really transforming the economy here into a clean energy economy. When we were starting off in 20, 25 years ago, the folks who were thinking about this topic were all weirdos, right? Me included, right? You go to the city council and you say, I'd like to do this thing and this project and whatever else, and you might as well have been pitching an art installation, right? That they had to spend 5 years trying to figure out, and then they had to do a big, we didn't have it back then, but a big GoFundMe campaign, and then, figure out how to do this stuff. I think today there are people talking about how thousands, tens of thousands of San Antonio residents have already wasted money buying a natural gas or diesel engine at their house to protect their family, when a battery storage unit could do it for way cheaper and pay them when it's not being utilized, right? And so today it's totally mainstream, and now you've got a bunch of people, many of whom are in this audience, who are saying, I've got my own unique idea on how this actually can get rolled out. And you have a whole bunch of people who actually want to hear those ideas because they view them as economic development, right? They view them as a way in which more business can be done in the city.
Beyond just San Antonio, there's been a lot of changes, obviously, in 25 years. Texas is moving quickly towards a more renewable future. But what are some of those markets that have really been really leading the way and have helped push the transformation along?
Well, the pushing of the transformation, obviously Texas was one of the first markets to push back in the late 90s. And so, Texas has been leading for a very long time. But the real push is in states and areas where you have very high penetrations. So for instance, Xcel Energy in Colorado, has actually said, look, when the production tax credit is sort of going down, we're going to buy 3,000 megawatts of wind that we didn't really need at this point because we want to benefit the ratepayers and buy it at $20 or $30 a megawatt hour and put it in early. You're starting to see that in places like Idaho or Nevada, and frankly, even in Georgia, right? And so I think that you're starting to see these markets where, where it used to be just Texas, California, North Carolina, had been leading the way. Now you're seeing this next crop of states that are saying, this is actually just purely in the best interests of the economic development requirements of the state, which the utility has a strong incentive to participate in, but also, ratepayer value.
So 25 years ago, we had all the weirdos getting together, advocating, let's get more solar on the grid.
That's right.
Let's build more transmission or better transmission to meet that demand. But now, here we are, 2019, on the cusp of 2020, and we're not weirdos anymore. We're kind of mainstream. How do we create a shared vision in the U.S. and around the world that is moving solar, storage, and renewable energy forward from both a business economics perspective and then also an environmentally sustainability perspective?
Well, I'm not much of a sort of, political person, Republican, Democrat, whatnot. But I think when you think about this sort of, Jay Inslee's candidacy, right? Politicians in general are not environmentalists, right? Politicians are, if you're good, actually are, good at listening to stakeholders, figuring out what's buzzing in the community, and figuring out how to bring a lot of different people together. And the fact that, he was able to take 14 pages on a Green New Deal resolution and create hundreds of pages, right, in ag and buildings and electricity and water and whatnot, transportation. And now you see the rest of the Democratic field competing over who can put out their climate change plan the fastest, right? Andrew Yang's dropped a couple days ago. Bernie Sanders dropped last week. I think Kamala's putting hers out on Thursday. And so you've got all of these plans coming out, right? I don't know that any of them are any good, right? But the fact
You haven't read them all yet?
I have read most of them, but the fact that they feel compelled to actually put not just one page on their website that takes 16 clicks to get to, but actually a real plan that's 24 pages or whatever, means that there's a whole bunch of people who actually care about this issue and are making their voices heard, right? Whether it's frontline communities or unions, or whether it's figuring out how banks and finance get involved in how this happens. There's a lot of sort of NIMBY-YIMBY sort of issues around, whether we get to higher levels of density. And so the fact that these conversations are no longer sort of, in the back, sort of 10 people getting together at some sort of town hall meeting, but now being discussed at a national level, means that there's definitely that level of participation that you're talking about, not just here, but globally.
Well, was this engendered because of the crisis that we're seeing around the potential of climate change, or is this just a general progression because the prices of solar and storage and wind have all come down? Is it economic? Is it societal? What is causing that transformation?
Oh no, what's causing the transformation is leadership.
Okay.
Right? I mean, the fact that Greta Thunberg or Jay Inslee or others just, said, look, I'm willing to raise my head up, and if it gets chopped off, it gets chopped off, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? I mean, we were all there in 2008, right? And when you think about the #1 job creator in the entire United States since 2008 Great Recession, 1 out of every 20 jobs created by our economy since 2008 has been in clean energy, right? So it's not a small number. When you think about blue-collar jobs, we are by 2x larger than any other sector, right? Think about, in 2008, we were, as a total industry, at maybe 200,000 people or so. Not just solar, but solar, wind, LED manufacturing, EV manufacturing. And the National Association of Home Builders was at 2.1 million, right? And they had a recession, and then you would assume that they hired people back. Since that time, we've hired twice as many people as the home builders have across the country into our profession. So I just think that we've been the place you go if you want a career, right? If you don't want to be part of the gig economy and you don't want a new job every 6 months, this is the place you come to be able to get a career for 10 years, right? Or 20 years or more, right? And so it's just that nobody wanted to talk about it. Everybody was very soft-spoken about it. We were all sort of like, well, we're kind of supportive of those solar people, but, we got pat on the head a little bit. And now I think people are recognizing us for what we are, which is one of the leading drivers of the economy.
That's a great point. I mean, and exactly to this, you pointed out in 2003 that there were roughly 20,000 people working in the solar industry. Now there are more than 1 million globally. And inversely, you look at, and I'm not trying to knock coal here, but there's less than 100,000 people in the United States that work in coal. Where has this growth really come from?
Yeah, I think that when you think about what it takes to make this revolution occur, think about for a second DirecTV. The only way people get DirecTV is you get accosted in Home Depot or other places, and someone says, you need to have DirecTV. It's cheaper. It's better than your cable guy. Unless someone gets in your face and says, you need to pay attention to this for 5 minutes, right, then nothing happens. Like this notion that people just like get little search ads in Google or in Facebook or whatever, and they click on something and say, this is a great day to spend $20,000, right? That's not how this works, right? Someone has to come to your house. Someone has to like knock on your door. Someone has to get in front of you. And the solar industry is one of the few industries that's invested in that level of sales, right? And then on the back of that, you have all the people who have to install the solar, and and then in this country, for better or for worse, every rule set for permitting is done at the local level. So even in Texas, every single city has their own set of rules, and so there's 3 people who are experts in permit law, right, and figuring out how to do that, right? And so there's tons of jobs in all of those areas, and many of those jobs don't require a master's degree. Right? And many of those jobs actually just require people who are dedicated to learning a new skill and learning a new craft and putting their, minds to figuring it out.
As we think about how solar and storage are going to play over the next 10 years, we're discussing the points of integration over the next couple of days. Integration between the utility and their customers, policy, regulators, stakeholders, and integration between renewables and our energy system. What are the key components for those individual integrations and integration of the system as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really complicated.
It's a long question.
Complicated question. I'll answer it in a couple parts, right?
Sure.
One is that we have desperately needed energy storage in our grid for 40 years, right? So this is not about renewable energy. This is about the fact that our grid has gone from around 81, 82% utilization back in the 70s to today less than 65% utilization, right? So that means that as air conditioning has sort of gone up, because very few people had air conditioning in the 70s and it really came on board since then, we decided to solve that problem with natural gas peakers, which was absolutely the worst way to solve that problem, right? Very expensive, less than 20% capacity factors, and you basically use the grid in ways that are less than ideal. You could have solved that problem by just putting in thermal storage at every commercial air conditioning facility, right? We've had it since 1901, since like CalMac and these companies where you make chilled water or you make ice or whatever during off-peak times, right? So the technology has been there for 100 years, right? We just chose not to solve the problem with demand dexterity, and instead said we're going to solve it with supply dexterity. We're going to have a whole bunch of peaker plants that some grid operations group knows how to turn on and off and whatnot, right? And so now we've realized that that's super expensive, right? But remember, the reason why we have renewable portfolio standards is not because anyone cares about clean energy, right? We have renewable portfolio standards because everyone was scared out of their mind about natural gas, right? In 2001, when California's entire economy almost went under because of the power crisis, that was a natural gas crisis. The same thing occurred in Texas, which is why George W. Bush pushed more renewables. It was a diversity play and saying we need more diverse assets and we can't just be reliant on one fuel source. And so that's why we have storage coming in now, right? It's not, and when I was a young engineer, I was working with Sandia National Laboratories. We were testing lithium-ion batteries and vanadium redox batteries and all that stuff back in the 90s. So it's not like this stuff is brand new, came out of nowhere, right? And so I think it's important for us all to remember is that the utilities were doing something that was in all of our collective, not best interests, by choosing to have supply dexterity instead of choosing demand dexterity, right? And then sometime around 5 years ago, the utility company said, well, in order to penalize solar and wind, we're going to tag them as unreliable, and therefore they need to add battery storage to make themselves more reliable, which nothing could be farther from the truth. The way that, as ERCOT knows better than any place, wind is actually very predictable 15, 30, 45 minutes before you need it, right? And you do a bunch of weather studies and you figure out what's going to happen. And what we really need is battery storage at the nodes to be able to get better utilization of our assets. So instead of doing it at the nodes, because utilities were slow to do it, I mean, Oncor tried and then didn't get rate base recovery for it. We've said, well, why don't we just co-locate it with the solar and wind guys because they seem competent and they know what they're doing, and we're going to now use those batteries for grid services, even though they're going to install it for us, right? And so we've sort of allowed this myth to perpetuate that solar has to be paired with storage or wind has to be paired with storage, but it's actually the grid that needs that resource, and it just happens to be that we're better at financing it than the broader utility system. The other thing I would say is that Americans in general, let's call it over the last 20 years, have voted with their pocketbooks to secure their families' energy future by buying diesel and natural gas engines. And those are expensive, right? They're whatever, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, and then another $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 to install them properly, and then another $500, $600 a year just to get them tested to make sure they actually work, which of course no one does. And then when a crisis occurs, their backup generator doesn't work. And so you could imagine that investment could easily be done in battery storage as well, right? And paired with solar for a lot of homeowners. And then that battery could be a grid resource. The challenge we have right now is that the rule set by which that gets done is not really there, right? And so whether it's in the PJM where they make you bid in 100 kilowatt increments, or whether it's in ERCOT or whether it's in California ISO, none of these places have actually figured out a clear set of rules by which people get paid for residential assets to bid into the market. And then that multiplies even more because you've got electric vehicle charging now. And you could actually bid a lot of that capacity into the market as well. And so I think that this is really, like most things in life, I'm a hammer, so everything looks like a nail. To me, it comes down to financing and how you're going to do it, right? The residential stuff makes sense because there's somebody with a FICO score who wants to do it, and you just fund it, right? The large-scale merchant plants are going to be more difficult, right? The guys or gals who come in today are going to probably make a lot of money, which is great. But the folks who come in 7 years from now, if the market's oversupplied at that point, we'll eliminate all the $9,000 megawatt hour price points, and the returns will be lower, right? And so we're going to have to figure out how that works itself through. But I am super excited about the concept of DERs, right? And then battery, so sort of behind the meter battery storage, EVs, thermostats, et cetera, playing this demand dexterity role that we should have pursued 30 years ago, but didn't really do.
Well, that's a great point, and let's dig in on that idea of distributed energy resources for just a moment. You mentioned that a lot of Americans have voted with their pocketbooks and gone and got generators to guard against the power outages that occur maybe one or two times a year. And that battery storage might actually be is actually a better opportunity for them. Is this a chance for the utility company to re-engage with their customers around DERs and have an opportunity to create a better relationship, provide a valuable service, and, oh, by the way, make some money doing that?
Well, all of this is better done by the utility companies, right? I mean, we are all in business basically betting on the fact that the utility companies won't do it, right? I mean, ultimately, when you think about the companies that we've started, right, they have random names. They usually have the word green or clean or something in it, and we're knocking on doors saying, hey, why don't you trust me? And the guy's like, I've never heard of you, and and all that stuff, right? But we overcome it. We work hard, and we get folks to trust us, and then we make money by deploying solutions. Clearly, if I had the utilities brand behind me, I'd be able to sell more units. I'd be able to get higher response rates to my mailers. I'd be able to get, more enthusiasm, because whether or not people had a power outage, they still trust the utility, right? And so I think if the utility did decide to get in this in a full-throated manner, I think they would be very successful. And then they certainly could do it through outsourced partners and that kind of stuff
The
too.
trade allies that you see around energy
Yeah,
efficiency.
so I don't know that it's either or, but I think if the utility companies said, we're going to get involved and we're going to figure out how to utilize people's Nest thermostats or Ecobee thermostats to bid that capacity into ERCOT, or we're going to do this and that, and we're going to create a rule set, and we're going to let people opt out and all that stuff, I think that people would love it. Same thing is true with electric vehicles. The biggest problem with electric vehicles that I see is that when people, like, particularly in places like Texas, but also other places where, like, I grew up in the Midwest, everyone seems to have 2.5 cars. And switching one car to an EV is really a no-brainer. It doesn't really, hurt you from a range anxiety perspective because you can just take the other car if you have range anxiety that day. And so, but if both, members of the household can't agree, then they're not going to buy that EV, right? And so the utility can play a huge role like they did in the 1930s in educating consumers by saying, we're going to buy up all these used EVs. We're going to let you have a shot at, renting it for a month, putting your golf clubs in the back, putting your car seat in there, see if it meets your lifestyle needs, et cetera. You give it back to us after a month, or you can buy it from us, and then go out and buy whatever car you actually really want to buy, right? And they would do that and they would sell more kilowatt hours, right? Which in a place even like with CPS, selling more kilowatt hours is actually the key to keeping rates low. The fact that we haven't had real volume growth in this country has meant that all of the standard repairs that we have to make to the grid are more expensive on a cost per kilowatt hour basis. So I think there's a lot of things the utilities must lead on that we actually should expect them to lead on, because it's very difficult to see how the outside of utility private sector can really do it.
And in those comments, you mentioned the idea of partnerships with all of these other companies that have come into the space from a solar and storage perspective to try to fill the gap that utilities so far have left open, and along with electric vehicles. How can utilities and those companies, can they coexist? Should they coexist? Can they collaborate more effectively together?
Well, I mean, today I would say that the private sector outside of the utilities is so strong that the utilities have allowed them to get so large that they don't need the utility in a way that's, it sort of is what it is. Where the utilities play a crucial role is monetizing all of the benefits, right? As we talked about, for a lot of the benefits that come from demand dexterity, these private companies can't just bid that capacity into ERCOT and get paid for it, right? And so the utilities could bid that capacity bundled with their capacity into ERCOT much more confidently, and use this other capacity as maybe an insurance product even against one of their units failing or whatnot. And so they could provide that. So in California, where the utilities have definitely not been helpful, they've had these things called CCAs, community choice aggregations. So they actually need to provide what you call resource adequacy. So in 2001, when we had the energy crisis, each utility now has to say, we definitely have the capacity to meet this season's peak demand, and they have to contract for it. It's sort of like a capacity charge. So the CCAs now have a responsibility to meet part of the capacity charge instead of the utilities doing it. And they're, of course, far more nimble and far more prosumer. So some of them are saying, well, why don't I do that by contracting for the battery capacity that Sunrun's customers have for their solar plus storage systems, right? Or why don't I contract that with this commercial customer who's putting a 200 kilowatt hour behind the meter battery in there, right? And so they're actually taking price signals that are being provided to them by the California Public Service Commission and California ISO, and transparently providing it to private sector companies so that they can actually make the numbers work for their customers. So utilities are essential in doing that, because I don't have the responsibility of keeping that distribution substation going and non-wires alternatives and all those things. And so they're the ones who have those calculations and can say, great, if you provide this service, then we can pay you this for that service, right? So I do think the utilities will play this critical role, but I do think that at some point this group is not looking to be stopped, right? And so they're just going to keep innovating their way around whatever the the challenges are, and I would hope that the utility companies would engage and find a way to make that 1 + 1 = 3.
Well, speaking of that 1 + 1 = 3, and also going back to that idea of how much growth there's been in the industry over the last 25 years, where's the growth coming from in the next 5, 10, 15 years, both from an employment perspective and then a market capitalization perspective?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think that, clearly the utility PPAs were the big driver of growth up till sort of 2015, 2016. Since then, I think you've been seeing a tremendous amount of growth from corporate PPAs, right? So large corporations who've said that I want to be 100% clean energy, but more importantly, I actually want to know that commitment is coming from additional resources that wouldn't have existed unless we signed this contract. You're now seeing companies like Level 10 and others saying we can broaden that to smaller players. So if you have a local coffee chain that has 80 locations, they can now get their piece of the 100 megawatt solar farm by buying 6 megawatts of it or whatever it is. And then now you're getting cities, right? Georgetown obviously being very famous, but also others who are saying, we're going to sign a municipal PPA and do the same thing and unlock that capacity. And Austin, obviously, and San Antonio have done that through their municipal utilities. And so I think that those are sort of this organic growth driver. But ultimately, I think we all have to acknowledge as participants in a private market, right, that we're not going to achieve these goals of increasing our marketplace by 3, 4, 5x, right, which is what is called for within the decarbonization plans by 2030 or whatever it is, without government regulation, right? That's just not going to happen. Like, people aren't just going to be able to build 72,000 megawatts of solar and wind in Texas without some sort of legal framework by which they are guaranteed that they're going to get paid. And so, there's some states, obviously, that will lead that charge more than other states. But I do think that the global growth that you see is coming largely on a macro basis from government regulation. And then you see a lot of this innovation at the local level to figure out how that trickles through.
On that subject of regulation, and precisely to that point, there's been a lot of policy aspirational goals that we've seen from California to more than 100 municipalities around the United States that said we're going to be either it's 100% renewable energy or decarbonized energy by X date, 2040 to 2060. Yep. How do we take those policy prescriptions and create the right type of regulatory framework to make sure that people get paid as you so accurately described it?
So I don't know that I have the answer to that question. I can say that as somebody who, I think still is probably a little bit of a weirdo, going to people in 1995 and asking for this stuff was pretty hard, right? People were just like, why are you even here? Right? What is it that you're asking for? Why would I even give you what you're asking for? The reason why we've got 10 or 11 states who've passed these clean energy standards, whether they be 50% or 100% or whatever it is because they actually have confidence in our ability to innovate ourselves into providing affordable solutions for consumers, right? I don't know that we know the answer around whether they should be long-term PPAs or whether they should be short-term PPAs with merchant tails or whether we should have more distributed generation. Like in California, they're mandating, basically net zero energy homes, and they build 200,000 homes a year. So if you put 10 kilowatts on every one of those facilities, right, you're talking about something on the order of 2,000 megawatts of new solar just on new homes. So, I think that there's lots of angles by which this can be done. But we're experimenting, right? So, California's got its own way of doing things. New York's New Deal is a different way of doing things. And each one of the states will be their own laboratories, and they'll all figure out whatever works for them. And some of them, hopefully, will learn from each other and say, well, actually, their system works better than ours, and so we'll adopt that one. But I think the fact that they have enough confidence in all of us collectively to even pass such a law, because they know that it's not going to destroy affordable energy. They know that this is actually something that is going to inspire innovation and inspire economic development while still protecting consumers is a big step for many of us who've been having this conversation for 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real sea change, that
Yeah.
the price of a kilowatt hour has come down so significantly on all of these renewable energy sources that it has become conceivable, and it's probably only going to decrease further as more of it comes onto the grid.
Yeah, I hope not, but
Okay.
yeah, I mean, hell, we're at like 2.3 cents kilowatt hour. At some point, you got to say that it's a little too cheap. Folks need to get paid a little bit
Right.
in the middle.
Right. Everyone here wants to get paid, and
I hope it doesn't keep going down much further. In general, I think that what we need to do is start to think more like utilities and less like, IPPs, right, independent power producers. And we should be thinking about what additional value streams we could provide consumers, what additional value streams we could provide the grid as a whole, and figure out how we get paid for that, right? So instead of saying we need to be at 2 cents kilowatt hour, 1.5 cents kilowatt hour, whatever, we should be saying how do we get paid an extra penny a kilowatt hour for providing these additional services. And I think that's, I'm hopeful where this is going.
and that's probably where the integration comes in.
That's right.
So what are the biggest challenges that the industry is facing in the next 5 to 10 years? Is it the ITC step down? Is it tariffs? Is it a lack of consistent regulation and policy across different marketplaces? Is it all of them?
I mean, it's all of those things,
Yeah.
right? But I think it's sort of like saying, what's the largest thing that is facing the, sort of modern oil industry in the Permian Basin, right? Or what's the largest thing that's, affecting, home ownership in this country if you're Home Depot or Lowe's, right? Everyone's got a set of negative factors that are going on, and everyone's got a whole bunch of positive factors that keep them inspired and optimistic every day, right? And so we're all sort of filled with both thought processes, and we're all balancing the two. And in at least the industry that I've been a part of for 20 plus years, we've had to shift our business model every 2 years pretty radically. I don't know anybody who basically is like, oh yeah, I'm doing the same thing I was 3 years ago, because the market's changed that quickly. And so if you're not able to say, well, here's what we get paid now, so I'm moving over here now, then you're probably out of business. So I don't think any of those headwinds are ones that people are, viewing as some sort of death of the industry. I think they're all just variables that get punched into an equation, and a strategic plan is outputted from that, and you shift your focus based on the variables that are on the street.
I do want to open it up in just a moment for some questions from the audience. So if think about those questions, and if we do have a microphone in the back, we'll bring that around to your table. But as we talked about those challenges, you talked about at the same time some of those positive things that we always need to keep in mind. And we've had this conversation, and it's pretty clear to both of us and probably everyone in the audience that there is a real societal challenge right now out there with around the idea of climate change, but that we have some agency over this. And we have agency in this way that can also be, from an economic perspective, a truly transformative experience. You've called this the greatest wealth generation opportunity in a century. Inspire this audience a little bit, inspire me a little bit with some of that vision right there.
Well, I'm certainly happy to do that, but I frankly think that this audience inspires me more than that. So I'm going to leave the glossy speech to the politicians who come through San Antonio. I think, I think that for everyone who works in this industry, they're motivated by something, right? Their children, their loved ones, folks who got affected by Harvey or Katrina or other things. I think that there's a lot of reasons why we're inspired to do what we do, making money being one of them and providing for our families. But I think that what really matters, and I think what has changed in the last 4 or 5 years, which I like, is that people have events in their life all the time, right? Birthday parties for their children, anniversaries, whatever it is. And for a long time, people didn't talk about what they did, right? For a long time, people would come over, what do you do for a living? Oh, I develop energy projects, right? Or I sort of work in the utility space, or whatever it is, not trying to create any sort of waves, or not trying to create any, ruffle any feathers, have an argument there. And I think people are now more proud about saying, well, I work in the solar industry, or I do energy efficiency, or, I help people with their energy needs, and, I help people save money, or whatever it is that you say. And that has a huge impact on this agency thing, right? Like, you can do lots of things, right? Put solar on your own roof, put storage, buy an electric vehicle, do a lot of things to save energy, fly less, whatever it is that you care the most about. But talking to people like, our Frank Hank Hill used to do on his propane business for King of the Hill, that stuff matters.
Good local reference right there.
But that stuff matters, right? Being proud of what you do, matters to your kids and your family, but also it matters to your community, and it inspires other people to say, well, gosh, maybe I could join this industry, and it inspires the politicians to be like, hey, maybe there is a constituency here that cares deeply about these issues, and I should be more concerned about these things when I'm passing some sort of ordinance around which building codes we should be on this year. I mean, most cities in this country are on like 2005 building codes, right? Upgrading them to 2015 building codes would be a huge boon for all of us, right? And so, to me, the agency issue and the inspiring thing is that we're here today because we're powerful. We're not here today because some fairy went around and said, here's some dust, here's some dust, here's some dust, like we have a clean energy standard. When, in Idaho, when they tried to reverse the net metering standard, there are only like 200 families in all of Idaho that had net metering. They all showed up to the Public Service Commission, many of whom were in their 70s, and said, look, I did this because I'm on a fixed income, and utility rates here have been going up by 5% a year, and I need to lock things in. It got to the point where the Public Service Commissioners were crying, and they actually wrote the most scathing sort of rebuke of a utility I've ever read, right? And that's because 200 or so net metering clients came to the hearing. Right? This country really does practice radical democracy as much as people want to talk about being a republic. Every water permit is adjudicated by a water board. Every one of these infrastructure projects we work on has to go through like 5 or 6 different permit bodies. People showing up and saying, I care about my community, I care about how this stuff works, I care about, air pollution, all these things, makes a huge difference, and it's the only reason we're here. Really, the only reason we're here is because 4 people show up to that meeting when it's usually 0 people and say, you know what, I kind of care. I kind of care if you build this plant. I kind of care if you do this. I kind of care if you do that, right? And so what I would say to you is for someone like me who has a 3.5-year-old and, and I hate traveling and being away from him, it's more work, right? I mean, you got to go to some meeting at 7 p.m. and you got to stand in line to be able to talk, and you got to put your name on the list, and it sucks, right? And you're like, I could be home, right? Why am I here, right? But that, to me, that is what has made our industry into a $200 billion industry in the United States alone, is because enough people sacrifice their time and effort to do that, that we're able to move the ball forward. So I really want to thank all of you for doing that and inspire you to continue to do that, because that's what makes the biggest difference.
Well, Jigger, that's very inspiring, and I also appreciate you taking time away from your 3-year-old, your family, to come down here and
my
visit
pleasure.
us.
My pleasure.
We've got some time. We've got, so if anybody has any questions for Jigger, we'd love to answer those. So this gentleman right here in the front here, do we have a microphone coming around right now? One.
Should I jump in and be the first while that's happening? So without going into too much detail, I mean, like I'm here on a professional front and then like as a citizen, right? And I think we are all on those 2 levels. So I won't spend too much time on this, Jigger, but I wanted to touch on, you're talking about like financing and how like nobody wants to just like click a button and part with $20,000. There has to be a human involved to like do the convincing, and on the commercial side, that's where that's most effective. So, like most people here, I'm on the business side here with Craig Collier with Deliano Resources. We were going to contact you after Jigar. But then on the social front, I live in a neighborhood, and I'm the president of an advisory board with the city of Lubbock. It's the Public Improvement District. We basically are developing a playa lake north of an elementary school with an assessment rate from property owners' money. And I own a co-working space where, I was talking with different parking solutions for solar. And so, funding these things, like, if the private side's always doing it best, just like the public-private partnership, basically, like, if I'm to convince the city of Lubbock that they need to spend money on solar and, like, in partnership, it's like that we're no longer crazy, right? Like, at least the people in this room won't call each other crazy, but how do we defend ourselves? Like, what's the, basically, like, can I, like, call you up from the Lubbock City Hall and be like, Jigar says yes? Like, what's the way to galvanize, so that's basically why we're all here, but I don't know. So basically if you're familiar with Lubbock, we're not in ERCOT yet. Personally, for me, like, what's the most convincing thing for the city? If everybody in their communities can do this as well as the commercial stuff that we're here to do. Thanks so much. And
No, look, I appreciate the question. I don't have an easy answer, right? I was inspired coming to San Antonio, meeting Bill Sinkin, who, basically built many of the major sort of art installations in San Antonio since the 1960s because he just cared deeply about San Antonio. And, and I bet every one of those conversations with Lyndon Johnson and on forward were a pain in his ass, right? And convincing people that we needed this, like, lookout tower, or we needed this, or we needed that was not something that was easy. And so I don't know that anything I'm gonna say to you is going to make your job easier or give you an argument that's more effective to your community, except to say that what we do is inspiring, right? And the people of every community that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of and to visit want to be inspired, right? They want to be inspired by their local leaders, right? And I think what you're pitching is an inspirational view, and you should stick to that inspirational view. It's one of those things where, I'm in a community that basically, hates real estate developers. And, they're all NIMBY folks. And I meet a lot of these real estate developers, and I'm, generally more open-minded. I'm inspired by them, right? They basically go out and say, here's 15 acres of farmland. I'm going to, purchase it. Here's my grand vision of what this is going to be in 15 years, because that's how long it takes to build it out, right? And they inspire people to put it together, right? You're doing the same thing. So I don't know that I have any advice to make it easier, and I'm happy to give you a cutout of myself with a bubble that says that Jair does it. But I think that it's really, the hard work of convincing people one at a time.
Hi, Jigger. I'm John Sorgan. You and I met in Austin a few years ago. I'm retired from a large business I used to lead that was involved in the energy and utility business. And one of the things that we had predicted 15 or 20 years ago, you actually brought up, and that is creating a market for energy trading that'll eventually reach the endpoint for distributed energy resources and management down to the households.
Yeah.
I'm now an investor and have been investing in some companies. I'd be interested in your views on technologies and policy regulations that need to change in states and municipalities. And one particular technology that seems promising right now is using blockchain technologies to create a more efficient market for trading that eventually could lead right down to the household, and I being able to sell 50 kilowatts of energy, perhaps.
No, that's a great question. So in general, I sort of recoil from like blockchain just because I find it sort of just a word. To me, I think it's, look, to the extent that I'm putting $100 million into something and we're basically building out all this infrastructure and we work with a retail electricity provider who provides a free home automation system with every single customer, and then they control their loads, whether it's the air conditioning system, et cetera. The blockchain piece of it solves the transaction cost piece of it, right? And so if transaction cost was the problem, and I was losing a third of the revenue stream through transaction costs, and I needed a solution for that, then yeah, blockchain would be great. But I don't think that's the problem today. I think the problem is that I don't actually have free and unfettered access to the marketplace with the $100 million investment that I've made, right? And so even though I put in the right EV charger that actually is IP addressable, that allows me to control it, or I've hacked the person's app because they've opted in and allowed me to control the car through the app and know exactly what the state of charge is, so that if it's at 60% state of charge, I can screw stuff around, and if it's below that, then they really need to be charging. And there's lots of things that you can do in that layer. But the biggest challenge I've seen is that the utility industry in general just believes that we're flakes, right? And my point to them is like, look, give me the same contract to give everybody else, which includes penalties, right? So if I bid 30 megawatts and I don't deliver 30 megawatts, then I have to pay the same penalties that the natural gas provider who doesn't give 30 megawatts has to provide, right? So like, I'm happy to like agree to those penalties, but they don't even give me a chance. They say like, no, we're just not gonna give you a contract because we don't think you're gonna be there when we need you. And so therefore we're gonna give you some pilot contract that's like 3 months in length, and we'll see how it goes, and then maybe we'll give you 6 months. But I look, well, how do I do a $100 million deployment, which actually gets to scale? Instead, I'm doing $800,000 deployments, like, because that's all I can get venture capital for to do these pilots, right? And I think that that's the bigger challenge. I'm a huge supporter of reducing transaction costs, and so if blockchain is the right way to do it, I don't know that I'm smart enough to know, but I certainly get a whole bunch of PowerPoint presentations on different ways to do transaction costs. But I think blockchain is probably pretty promising.
We've got time for just a couple more. Kimberly, one quick second. We've got a microphone in the back there, so.
Hello, Jigger. Mike Sloan with Vertus Energy. I've worked on renewable policy here since the 1980s, and just a statement perspective, incentives need to be regionally appropriate. And I know when I heard you say about California's net zero for residential, I just hate that if it were to come to Texas, and you'd probably need to have a free coupon for a chainsaw if you were going to do that program, since about 90% of the houses have trees, right?
Right.
So anyway, what our bigger issue is, I think here and what we're working on, we've always strived to have high value renewable energy policies. But our PUC and ERCOT are working right now a lot on storage. And the question is, it seems like a fundamental frustration for us has always been we're not able to really milk the value that storage really brings to the market. You sort of have to pick just one little value out of the full spectrum that it brings. Is there a recommendation you have for whether a best practices for a competitive market for a state or RTO we should be looking at? Or a specific idea that you would want to throw in?
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with you completely that policy has to be state-specific, regionally specific, culturally specific, right? So I'm certainly not suggesting that what California does should be replicated here, as much as to say that it can be meaningful, right? That California is going to add 2,000 megawatts of solar every year now, just through residential. And for them, their average peak demand might be only 35,000 megawatts in general, and then maybe it gets up to 50 a few days of the year. In terms of battery storage, look, this has been the big problem, right? MIT put out that study in 2012 and basically said here are the 17 different value streams. And then since then, every Energy Storage Association conference gives me another update of like this guy's modeling, and Chris Clack did this, and this guy did that, and here's the thing, whatever else, it all pays for itself. And you can't get access to it, which is what I was saying earlier around getting the utilities to pay you for it. I think Texas is in a particularly difficult situation because of the deregulation into 3 different parts. So because it's 3 different parts, it's harder to get each of the parts to coordinate with each other and say, the transmission distribution people are going to pay this, and the retail folks are going to pay this, and the generation folks are going to pay this, right? And so, unfortunately, I think where you're going to see Texas trend towards is some of the more vertically integrated players, like whether it's the NRGs of the world or others, who have more assets where they can internally take some of those benefits, is where it's going to come out. And for the private sector folks, you have to get a hedge from the customer, right? So you basically get a resiliency hedge where some grocery store or somebody else says, yeah, I'll pay extra because I don't want to lose my food when a hurricane comes through. And then you really benefit from that one value stream, and then you layer on the other value streams on a merchant basis. But I haven't seen a very clean way, even in California, to monetize the various streams in a contracted basis, right? You can certainly do it on a merchant basis, but then, then your cost of capital goes to 20%.
Last question.
Just quickly, Jigger, I think this is a great group for you to share about Clean Tech Leaders Roundtable.
Oh, thank you.
And that sort of the vision that you and Ari and Tom and the gang conceived, and then our work in that space.
So Kim and I have worked hard to create, basically a set of people who share values in this space around clean tech leaders getting to know one another. What's amazing to me is how few people, even within their own cities, have actually met each other. And even if they've met each other for 10 minutes at a conference and don't actually know each other. And because of that, they don't really have the ability to have each other's backs because they don't really know each other well. And so what we've done is put together a series of dinners around the country. Kim's hosting one here on September 12th. To really help people know each other. Everyone pays their own way, so it's sort of Dutch, and so everyone's an equal around the table. And the goal of it is to actually create fellowship around the country, and and what that means can be that, hey, there's a press report over here that unfairly tagged our industry. We should respond to it in kind, or there is an opportunity to do something more proactive in our community here, and if we all pooled our resources together and spent time together to pass it, we could get it done. But it really serves to recognize part of what we've talked about today, which is that this industry only succeeds based on mutual respect between all of us, and then a common vision projected to politicians and other stakeholders, right? I think that in general, I refuse to believe, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, whatever, that anyone's against what we're doing. I think, doing more with less is something that everyone believes we should be doing. And so I think everyone's very interested in seeing this industry succeed, no matter what part of the political spectrum people are on. But it requires a level of investment, I think, by all of us into meeting our fellow warriors in the space and getting to know one another, so that when we really need each other, we're there for each other.
Well, thank you all for those good questions, and Jigger, I really appreciate your wonderful perspective and letting everybody get to know you a little bit better. So thank you so much.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thanks.